Hi, this is Brad Mayfield. I am the Director of Business Development for Greater Therapy Centers. Thanks for joining us today. In just a moment, Andrew Shaw will begin, but I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction first. Andrew is a physical therapist and works at our Rockwall location. His career experience has primarily been in outpatient orthopedics and sports medicine. He has a wide range of clinical experience, everything from working with farmers and ranchers in rural Nebraska to working at a training center where he worked with athletes from the NFL, the U.S. Olympic team, foreign national teams, and youth sports. He loves working with patients of all ages and various orthopedic conditions, but he has a particular passion for working with recreational athletes. Personally, he says he loves being active and exercising. He played football, basketball, and high jumped growing up. Participating in training for these sports led to a passion for weight training and led him to pursue a career in physical therapy. When he's not at work, he enjoys spending time with his family, his friends, and participating in recreational sports and also church activities. He says he loves getting people out of pain and back to the activities they love and enjoy. The body has an extraordinary design and has an amazing ability to adapt, and he thrives on getting to show patients what they can be capable of again when recovering from injury or surgery. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself now and turn over the presentation to Andrew, and I will be back at the end to wrap things up.
All right, thanks, Brad. Thank you for the introduction. And for anyone watching this, thank you for taking the time to join us for this presentation. I hope you'll find it interesting and helpful. So again, I'm Andrew Shaw, physical therapist, and we are going to be talking about preventing injuries in youth sports and kind of many facets kind of around that topic. So going in, want to cover briefly some objectives, just hopefully what you'll take away from this presentation at the end. So we want to be able to understand the risk factors of just what contributes to particularly overuse injuries, as there's some things we can do to lessen the likelihood of these occurring. We want to talk about some risk reduction strategies. We can't totally ever prevent any injuries, like every injury from happening, but we can definitely reduce their likelihood of them occurring. So we're going to talk about how to do that. And we want to talk about the long-term athletic development model, just what that is, and how that can lead to better performance and reduce injuries for your athlete. We are also going to look at ACL injury prevention programs, and we want to be able to describe what that is and just know kind of the components of it and how you might incorporate that yourself or with the athlete that you're working with. And finally, there's a lot of myths and misinformation around resistance training or weight training for youth athletes. And we just want to talk briefly about some recommendations for weight training and also some myths and just kind of dispel any rumors that might be harmful that are going around resistance training. So before we get too much into the injury prevention and some of the other information, we just want to briefly cover also some benefits of participating in youth sports, of why we might look to do these in the first place. So the first benefit is just peer socialization. It's a great opportunity for youth to learn just how to interact with each other, how to develop different interpersonal skills, and a great avenue for doing that. Going on, they're going to get the health benefits of physical activity. Just both a lot of positive things that occur as far as adaptations, as far as their muscles and joints and cardiovascular system. So just being physically active is something that we want to encourage. And it's an opportunity to develop teamwork and leadership skills. There are other avenues for this, but sports is a great way to get into some of those roles early and be able to develop those and carry those to other facets of life going forward. And then finally, we want to promote lifelong physical activity. Just if you're active early, kind of understand like either sports and have something you enjoy doing, or the training around sport, that it's easier to kind of carry that on the rest of your life, and it's going to have numerous health benefits for you going forward. So let's talk a few brief injury statistics just so we can have some scope of the problem and how we might look to address that. So looking at some statistics, the first one is just that there are 60 million kids that play youth sports, so it's a pretty substantial number of our kiddos that are playing in youth sports growing up, and 3.5 million are injured each year as a part of sports. So there's a good chance that you will encounter an injury if you are involved or a parent of a kid who's involved in sports. So just something that we want to address and see if we can't get that number a little bit lower. The first big topic that we're going to cover is overuse injuries. And this is something I'm particularly passionate about as a physical therapist, because this is the most common thing that usually brings athletes of any age in, is just some sort of overuse injury. And we'll cover what those are and how we might prevent them. So looking at a definition of just what an overuse injury is. And kind of the textbook definition is going to be either a repetitive submaximal loading or excessive loading that is occurring during one session. So it's basically just either too much stress that's occurring repeatedly over time, or too much stress that's occurring in one given outing of participating in sport. And kind of to summarize that, it's when your stress is greater than the recovery you allow your body to have. And there's some factors that we can do to kind of manage the stress or manage your recovery to reduce these risk of these injuries. So looking at the next thing of overuse injuries, are what are some common types of overuse injuries? What are you running into when we're talking about overuse injuries? One of the first ones that is very common that people are familiar with, although you might use a different term, are tendinopathies. And what this is going to be is some sort of tendon-related issue. And you see there's an Achilles tendon, but this can really occur in any tendon of your shoulder, your knee. And the reason we use a tendinopathy instead of a tendonitis is it's commonly thought that these are, by the public, that there's some sort of inflammation that's going on that's causing issues with the tendons, which can occur, and that can be an issue, but it can also be a weakness or structural issue with the tendon, and that tendinopathy kind of covers that whole range of conditions there. So there can be different issues with that. So that's going to cover that whole range. The next one that we want to see is an apophyseal or a physial stress injury. And these are going to be growth plate injuries, as far as either like you see in the picture there, where a tendon comes in and attaches to the bone, that you can get a stress reaction there, or also with the growth plates within the bone. And certain types of overuse can cause trouble there. In this particular picture, I chose this because this is what I think a lot of people are one of the most familiar with, is the Osgood-Slaughter's condition, just to where you get a little bit of pulling away of the bone, where that tendon from your big, strong quads and that patellar tendon comes down and attaches. You can get a little bit of kind of a stress reaction where it starts to pull away from the bone due to excessive or repeated loading, and the common condition there. And then finally, we have stress fractures, and this can refer towards that repeated loading. In this one, we're looking at a femoral neck stress fracture, commonly found in runners when either you're not managing your mileage or you're not allowing adequate recovery from your training bouts. So next thing of looking at some risk factors related to overuse injuries, what's going to contribute to the possibility of this recurring. One thing we want to talk about is the stage of growth and development of our athletes. There's been some good research that if you are in a growth spurt, that you're at an increased likelihood of injury at those times. Just there's a lot of changes, a lot of demands in our body during those times. So just want to be mindful of if you are going through that, or you have the son or daughter that's going through a growth spurt, it can just be an increased time for injuries to occur. Previous injury, in just about any study looking at the risk of injury, previous injury is almost always the number one thing that puts you at risk for having an injury again. So if you've had an injury, you just want to be mindful of that body part and maybe taking a look at what you might do to prevent that injury from recurring. We can have certain anatomic risk factors, just the way that our bones and other structures in our bodies are formed, can put us at increased risk for certain types of injuries, just because it leads to increased stress on certain parts of the body. One thing that we can do that's modifiable is our training workload. So how much we're doing in a given practice, or given like a sprinting session, weight training session, and just being mindful of how much we're doing there. Our training and competition schedules, it's just become more and more prevalent to have pretty grueling competition schedules, to where you're playing tournaments where you're playing multiple games over a weekend, to where you're playing a lot of games throughout a week without much rest, and just being mindful of how those schedules are affecting our athletes. Equipment can be a risk factor, just if you have ill-fitting equipment or incorrect, like say cleats for the type of surface that you're playing on, that those can be a risk factor for developing certain injuries. The environment, whether you're playing in a really hot, really cold, a dry or wet environment. There's certain things that if you're constantly exposed to those conditions that can lead to, again, some of these overuse injuries occurring. Sport technique, particularly of, I think of things like a pitcher would be a great example of just your throwing mechanics. Are you using good technique? Is it placing excessive stress on certain parts of your body? So that's something that your coaches or like your other medical professionals that you're working with can help you refine if you are getting some issues there. But that is something you can do to kind of look at modifying. And then for our female athletes, amenorrhea, just if you have that loss of your period, that is a sign of like the female athlete triad, which is just a particular condition that we're having trouble balancing, like or the demands of your sport, your energy intake, how much you're getting from food, and just your body weight. And that can put you at a particular risk for certain conditions. So just if you are experiencing that, or know an athlete that is something to be mindful of, as it can be a risk factor. One of the big things that you'll hear a lot of sports medicine physicians and physical therapists talk about is sports specialization, and particularly early sports specialization and the risks that those pose. So I wanted to take some time for attention to just covering this topic. Looking at the study here, they looked to define early sports specialization, and they defined it as intense year-round activity, particularly greater than 8 months, where you're focusing on a single sport while excluding other sports. And then there's a few sports that that require kind of early entry, or that you might think about doing a little bit younger or specializing, just because you reach your peak age in that sport, such as gymnastics or figure skating, where it's tend to be younger athletes that are competing at the highest level. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that your risk is lower in those sports, but just that is something, if you do want to attain those highest levels, that you might have to specialize a little bit earlier than we would recommend for some of the other sports. So covering a little bit more on sports specialization and the risks or the information around that. The study by Bell et al. Looked and found that high specialization led to a twice as likely outcome for sustaining an overuse injury compared to somebody who has a low level of specialization. And then this next study, they surveyed professional baseball pitchers, and they found, again, twice as likely that people who specialized had serious injuries throughout their career versus non-specialized peers. So it seems to be that there is this correlation with specialization and injury. So talking again a little bit more of some things that we can do to prevent these overuse injuries. What are our strategies there? Weekly and yearly time limits of both weekly in having scheduled rest and things like that throughout the year, and yearly of like how much throughout the year, that kind of that 8-month time period that we're looking to try to stay in one sport and having a few months off there. Scheduled rest throughout the week and throughout the year, that we are going to try to incorporate some things there to where you're giving your body that break, your chance to heal, to recover from those bouts of exercise and activity. Something that's been particularly helpful in certain sports where it's easy to quantify is workload restrictions. So pitch counts for pitchers has been really helpful of just keeping an overall eye on how much work your shoulder's doing, or elbows doing throughout like a given pitch, and trying to keep that within kind of an allowable range for your age. And then again, with running, another way is mileage monitoring, of just how much running you're doing throughout a given week, how quickly you're progressing your mileage. So something to be mindful of in sport. And then a good strategy overall for preventing overuse injuries or participating in a preseason conditioning program. The big thing here is it just allows your body to ramp up more slowly over time versus all at once, kind of just jumping right in from a season to maybe like some time off. And our bodies do really well at adapting to kind of that slow, gradual uptick in activity, versus we don't do as well when there's a big giant leap in activity all at once. Doing some sort of resistance training or weight training is going to be really helpful. That kind of places a stress on your muscles and bones that maybe the sports don't usually do. We usually get a lot of running and cutting and those jumping, those type of activities, but not as much of the kind of the slow, heavy resistance training that we might get from weight training. And those have some different effects for our body that are definitely beneficial for preventing injuries. Another thing is we can look at don't playing for multiple teams, particularly of like during one sports season, so not doing both like a school team and a club team all at once. And that plays into a lot of just managing that overall workload and having weekly and yearly time limits that you're thinking about putting on your athletes. But that can be a lot of information from all those points to take away. So I wanted to try to boil that down into 4 simple recommendations just for reducing these overuse injuries that you can try to keep in mind. So the first one is that if you're looking at how much activity should the athlete be doing, the hours per week of activity should be less than their age in years. So if you have an 8-year-old athlete, we're looking for less than 8 years of organized sport. Now this doesn't include things like free play, playing outside, but organized practices and games. That's something that we want to try to keep that underneath their age and years. Don't play a single sport greater than 8 months out of a year. Just again, allowing your that body off, allowing to do some different movement patterns, so you're not continually just throwing or kicking or whatever it is throughout the whole year, not giving your body a break from those specific movements from particular sports. Another thing that I'd really encourage is just participating in a resistance training program or participating in preseason conditioning. Both of these just have a ton of research around them that they are beneficial for reducing injuries. So if you're not doing either of those, I definitely encourage taking part. And then a final one that plays into more than just here, but particularly with reducing injuries, is getting adequate sleep. There's been research studies looking at both the increased injury and, like, say, a game after particularly poor night of sleep, that athletes are more likely to get injured during that game. And then also if you're accumulating a repetitive sleep debt, that you're not sleeping well over time throughout over weeks and months, that you're going to be at a higher likelihood of overuse injury if that is the case. Going on to our next topic, we're going to look at something that's been called the long-term athletic development model. And it's really just a fancy way of saying how can we more optimally develop our athletes. It kind of comes with 2 things of both. One, as a physical therapist, I think about as preventing injury, but also how can we achieve just the best level of athletic outcomes kind of over the course of your whole life versus maybe at just one point and kind of thinking taking them all the way to adulthood. So there's going to be 4 different phases of this model. We'll kind of go through each phase kind of depending on what age the child is and what type of factors in this development model there are. So the first one we're going to look at is just when they're young, this early childhood of 6 to 8, 6 to 9, depending on if you're male or female. So what types of things should they be doing at this age in sport? The first one is working on the fundamentals with the corny emphasis on fun. That's what we really want to be thinking of. Just make activity fun, make sports fun, allow them to enjoy it and fall in love with just doing activity overall. Working on a variety of movement patterns. So what do we mean by movement pattern? That's just something of learning how to throw, kick, jump, sprint, just all those fundamental things that we need to do to be good at sports. We should be trying to develop those overall characteristics in our athletes of just giving them opportunities to develop on how to jump properly, how to get better at those skills. And we also are looking at a variety of movement. So we don't want to just be hitting one movement pattern. For an example, like pitching, of just throwing and just the whole year, all the time, only doing that one motion. We want to be, running and cutting and jumping and throwing and kicking and just incorporating the whole kind of gamut of movements during this age period. Some characteristics of training or practice that you might work on, of looking at drills and things to develop balance, coordination, and agility. Those are the components that you'd really look to develop in athletes at this age. We're going to move on to late childhood. So again, more of that late elementary, middle school age. And again, varies depending on whether if you're male or female. This characteristic is going to be summarized by learning to train in this period. And really what that means is we just want to learn how to do the different things required in sport. So this is where we can really refine, like learning to shoot a basketball, learning to throw a baseball, all those different activities. We want to really try to learn the mechanics of those movements. Similar with the training as far as learn how to do the movements of, like if you're looking at doing a squat or a bench press, that we just really get the movements themselves down. And that's what we're really focused on, is just learning how to do all these motions and activities during this time frame. And then we still want to avoid specialization during this time, so don't want to really focus in on one sport. A lot of athletes tend to start focusing in on one sport during this time, but we'd like to discourage that for a little bit yet. And then still looking at that variety of movement versus just focusing on one activity or one sport. And some characteristics of training during this phase, we're going to be working on, again, balance, muscular endurance, incorporating some free weights. So, your barbells, dumbbells that you'd see in the gym, and then plyometrics, which is just, doing some basically jump training in this age. So moving on into adolescence, as we're kind of getting into that high school age, what should we look at developing our athletes here? This phase can also be kind of turned training to train, and it's just really a phrase that means this is a time to really get after the training on sprinting, jumping, weight training, trying to develop our peak like strength, our peak cardiovascular fitness. This is when our bodies are really just poised to really develop physically. So we really want to focus on the training aspect and developing kind of our body to, exert peak strength or to have their greatest endurance during this time. And then looking at incorporating heavy resistance training before in this phase, we can incorporate some of learning the movements earlier. But this is where we really start to get into higher levels and just really seeing how much weight we can add to the bar if we're participating in that activity. And then eccentrics is just a component of weight training that you could look to incorporate during this time. Something that I don't think is super specific that you have to include, but if somebody's interested in incorporating some eccentric training, this would be the time to start to bring that in versus earlier. Moving on to adulthood, what does training look like going forward from here? This is where we're really training to compete. So this might look better, so you're still working on your strength and your sprinting and things like that, but you also may be devoting more time to pure sport technique and really trying to refine that. So just really looking at maximal performance now, whatever you can do to get that little bit of edge in your sport. So we're really focusing on trying to put out the best product out there for competition. And then you're 100% clear to specialize. So something that you don't have to worry about, that you're kind of developed at this point, that you should probably be going more towards one sport and trying to develop that technique and that edge and kind of that chosen sport. And it's going to have the same components, just again a little bit more specific to kind of what sport or activity that you're participating in at this point. Moving on to our kind of next big topic, we want to spend some time talking about ACL injury prevention programs. We'll go through what they are, what the benefits of these programs are, and kind of how you might look to incorporate this. So what are ACL injury prevention programs? They're types of programs that include a variety of different exercises with different components such as strength training, balance training. Plyometrics are working on landing with good form, looking at agility training as well. And all these exercises are aimed at injury prevention. So they're trying to, land in a certain way or work on particular aspects of agility or balance that are geared towards preventing injury. The FIFA 11 Plus and Sports Metrics are kind of the brand names in this category that people might be familiar with. They've just gotten a lot of good exposure as far as particularly in soccer for preventing ACL injury. So you might see these out there as marketed as an ACL injury prevention program. Going in a little bit more of the research and kind of, are these useful, are they not, what should we do? Looking first, kind of this study found that the injury prevention programs reduce the rates of injury by 53%. So good protective effects seen with these programs. And then another study found that strength training reduced your injuries by threefold over a soccer season. So it seems that incorporating that is pretty effective in reducing injury. And then as well, another study just looking at strengthening your quads and your hamstrings, those muscles on the front and back of your thigh, and that if we see a good increase in those, that you're going to again see a good increase or decrease in the risk of injury. So talking a little bit more about injury prevention programs. The study looked at all these injury prevention programs out there of all the different varieties, and found that kind of no matter what one that you tended to find yourself choosing, that they all met pretty good guidelines as far as what we're looking to have in those programs, and that the programs all tended to work despite whether there's some variance of, if one had a certain type of balance exercises or one emphasized agility, that despite these different components that a lot of the creators of these programs think to be important, that they all tend to work pretty well, even if they have different aspects to them. But the component that they all had in common was strength training. So as you kind of saw from the other research on the last slide, that this is a particularly protective aspect of these programs. So I think as long as you're probably participating in some strength training, that you're getting a really good protective effect from these programs, or just doing the strength training by itself. So talking about the benefits of strength training, that kind of leads into our next topic of just talking about doing resistance training or strength training for youth athletes. Want to cover, when it's appropriate, kind of some fact and fiction that are going around this area, so there's some clarity on what we might do with our youth athletes with resistance training. So want to look at some myths and some facts around resistance training. So the first myth is youth athletes are too young to lift weights, it's going to stunt their growth, and that it harms growth plates. These are all kind of commonly held out as these are the reasons why you shouldn't do weight training. Some facts is it's a great time to learn to lift. It's a great opportunity to develop healthy habits and learn the movements so that you can do them later on in life. And it's going to lead to improved bone mass and strength, so it's going to have some positive outcomes as far as just your body and how it's adapting to that exercise. So what recommendations would we give for taking up a strength training program? So when should my child start doing this? A child can start participating in a program when they're emotionally mature enough and they can receive and follow directions. They have adequate balance and postural control to execute the movements, just that they can perform like a squat or bench press with good form. And then this can be typically ages 6 to 7 years, not necessarily that they have to start then, but really that you could look to go this young if you wanted to. So when they start to develop an interest in it, that they should be old enough that it's going to be totally safe for them to participate in strength training. So if they are going to undertake some strength training, what should that look like? What should that program consist of? Again, the study that this information is built off recommended 2 to 3 sets of 18 to 15 repetitions per exercise that you pick, and then that you're loading them somewhere between 60 and 80% of like their 1 repetition maximum on that exercise, and that they're doing 6 to 8 exercises overall. Kind of my takeaway that I would give you is that the training should be sufficiently hard, that they're picking a weight heavy enough that they're getting pretty tired between 8 to 15 reps. So as you're putting weight on the barbell or the machine, that if they're doing 20 plus reps, 50 reps, that's probably too light. Similarly, if they're down and they can only do 2 or 4 or something repetitions like that, then the weight is probably too heavy. So try to kind of get in between that range, and then try to pick enough exercises that you're hitting most major muscle groups for them. So looking at a summary of all the information that we talked about, want to hit some key points just to have some key take-home messages. Pay attention to the workload that we're doing with our athletes, both in a given week, given training session, but also over kind of month to month and over the whole course of a year. Just how much work are we doing, and are we allowing adequate rest? Want to encourage thinking long term. I've heard it said, nobody really cares who the best 8-year-old is out in the field, but there's a lot more people who care who the best 22-year-old is out in the field. So we want to think about taking these kids not to just be good today, but be good as they're becoming into adulthood, and trying to develop them over the course of the long term. ACL injury prevention programs are a good thing. That it's something that I try to encourage, like either coaches or parents to advocate for, that you're doing some sort of ACL injury prevention if you're, particularly if you're in a cutting sport. And then we want to think about resistance training. So this is one of the biggest protective mechanisms that we have for preventing injury. And we just really encourage kind of learning more about resistance training and then incorporating this as part of your training for sport. So just want to leave with my contact information as well. Again, I practice out in Rockwall, and my information is there if you have more questions, or you encounter some sort of injury yourself and would like some help recovering for that. That's where you can find me. And then we have a couple pages of references here to end our presentation. And that is it.
Thanks, Andrew. Really appreciate the information. Lots of great info, obviously very important topic, and something that a lot of our patients are discussing, and a lot of the physicians that we deal with, we discuss all the time. Very well done, very well thought out, and interesting. The beginning of this presentation, I think I said that you were in Rowlett, which is not true. You are in Rockwall. Andrew is in Rockwall at our Rockwall clinic. So you can find Andrew there, his contact information. Reach out to him if you have any questions. We also have 23 other locations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, staffed by physical therapists and occupational therapists. So if you need any help in any of those areas, we'd be more than happy to talk with you, set up a appointment for an assessment and evaluation. We even have telehealth options that are still available right now. So we look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Greater Therapy Centers. Therapy for life.